The assembly rooms at Bath were blazing on the first Tuesday of October, and every candle in them seemed to be burning for someone else. Eleanor stood at the edge of the entrance hall with a parcel from the mercer's shop tucked under her arm and a gown that was 2 seasons out of fashion, and knew it. The musicians in the upper room had begun a country dance, and the sound of it filtered down through the floor as a trembling, and she could feel it in the soles of her feet where she stood on the stone steps, not quite inside. She had come only to return a bolt of trimming that Mrs. Alford, the milliner, had sent to the wrong address. She had not intended to come inside at all. The door had opened under a footman's hand before she could retreat, and now the room was looking at her, or she felt it was, which amounted to the same thing. She was not wearing her wedding ring. She had not worn it for 14 months. The hall was full of the sort of people who had known her when she was Mrs. Bassett and now were deciding, with their sidelong glances and their carefully managed smiles, what she was now. She watched them make the calculation. She had grown accustomed to watching it be made. The season had rendered its verdict in March. When the decree was read aloud in a cold London chamber, with George Bassett sitting 3 rows away and looking at the floor, and the verdict had followed her to Bath in August, and here it was again in October, dressed in silk and holding a fan. She was crossing to the far corridor when she registered a stillness at the opposite side of the hall. She did not look directly. She had learned not to look directly at things that might look back. She caught only an impression: a tall figure near the terrace door, a navy coat, dark eyes already settled on her before she had quite entered the room. She felt the weight of the attention the way one feels a change in the temperature of air, without being able to name its source. She moved on, her own eyes forward, the parcel under her arm, her back straight. Behind her she heard a woman's voice, low and carrying, a voice accustomed to being attended to. "The Bassett woman," the voice said, and then, a half-beat later, cooler and more precise. "A divorced woman. One hardly knows where to look." Eleanor did not stop walking. She did not alter her pace or the angle of her shoulders. She had learned that, too. The sentence landed on her back like a stone dropped on still water, and she carried the ripple of it with her into the corridor, and she did not let it reach her face. She completed the errand. She thanked the room's manager and declined the glass of wine he offered. She left the building in 3 minutes, 30 seconds, which she counted internally, as she had learned to count the duration of such moments. She did not notice that the man at the terrace door had not moved from his position for the full duration of those 3 minutes, and that he had not once looked at the woman who had spoken, though the woman was standing at his shoulder. She would not have believed it if she had been told. She walked home through the cold October air with the tortoiseshell miniature of her mother tucked in her coat pocket, where she carried it always, and she thought, "It is the same in every room. Adjust accordingly." She was 26 years old, and she had already buried her father, lost her marriage, and reduced her domestic establishment to 2 rooms and a landlady who served questionable mutton. She had done all of it without causing a scene. That, at least, was something. It was not much. It would have to be sufficient. The Bath season had a machinery to it, and Eleanor had spent enough years on the periphery of that machinery to understand how its gears turned. She had come to the city in August with a letter of introduction from her father's solicitor and a recommendation to Mr. Ellsworth, who kept the mercer's shop on Milsom Street, and she had spent 6 weeks proving to Mr. Ellsworth that she could manage a ledger and maintain the correspondence without error, and Mr. Ellsworth, who was a practical man, had concluded that her past circumstances were less relevant to him than her handwriting, which was excellent. She earned enough to pay the rent on the rooms in Sydney Place, and to maintain herself with a dignity that was modest and real. She did not supplement her income by borrowing on expectation or writing to relatives. She did not accept charity. These were the choices she had made in the spring, alone in a rented room in London with the decree in her hand and the sound of traffic below the window, and she had not yet found occasion to revise them. The divorce had not been her idea. She wanted to be plain about that, at least to herself, even if she was plain about nothing else to anyone. She had been his wife for 6 years, and the 6 years had been ordinary years, quiet and steady, with a house in Wiltshire that she had managed well, and a husband who was pleasant in company and inattentive in private, and she had made a life inside those parameters without distress. She had not been passionate about him. She had been competent at being his wife, which had seemed to her at the time to be a reasonable thing to be. Then he had met Miss Clara Vane at a card party in Bristol, and the next 18 months had been a different kind of education entirely. She did not dwell on the particulars of that education. The particulars were available in the public record and had been noted in the relevant gazette, and were accessible to anyone who chose to be interested in them, and she had learned that a great many people chose to be interested. What she dwelt on instead, in the quiet of her 2 rooms in the evenings, was the morning the decree was read aloud, and the specific quality of the feeling she had then, which was not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, and which she had eventually identified as the feeling of having been told a thing she had not quite known she believed. She was not the kind of woman who got chosen. Not deliberately. Not finally. She was the kind of woman one managed for 6 years, and then left. Politely. For someone with better lighting. She had placed her mother's portrait on the shelf above the sitting room window. She looked at it in the evenings when the work was done. Her mother had been dead for 12 years, and she had had the portrait since she was 14, and it was the only object from the marriage that she had brought away without negotiation. He had not noticed it on the shelf in 6 years of looking at it. She supposed that was useful information about something, though she was not sure exactly what. She had settled into the quiet of her circumstances with a practicality that she recognized in her more honest moments. As a defense, if you expected nothing, you were not startled by the delivery of nothing. If you built your requirements small enough, they were meetable. She could manage the ledgers, she could keep the rooms, she could return parcels to the wrong addresses and walk home through the October cold without looking back at the warm windows of the assembly rooms. She was not, she told herself, unhappy. She was simply reduced to the version of herself that required the least from the world. If you have found yourself, in your own quiet moments, watching someone else make exactly this kind of peace with their circumstances and wanting to reach through the page and stop them, then you know already how this story goes. Stay with it a little longer. The mercer's shop on Milsom Street occupied the ground floor of a Georgian building that smelled of wool and cedar, and Eleanor had learned to navigate it the way she had learned to navigate most enclosed spaces, quietly, efficiently, and with her back turned to the window that gave onto the street, where people she knew occasionally passed. On the morning of the 14th of October, a woman Eleanor recognized entered the shop at 10:15. Mrs. Stanhope was the wife of a colonel with connections to most of the Somerset gentry and the personal habit of precise social categorization. She wore a primrose morning gown and a look of careful astonishment, which Eleanor recognized as the look people wore when they had known they would encounter her and had prepared a response in advance. "Miss, I wanted the blue poplin for." Mrs. Stanhope stopped. She refocused. "You are Eleanor. That is, forgive me." She looked at Eleanor with the expression of a woman setting down a calculation she had not expected to need. A divorced woman. In trade. How very modern. Eleanor set the bolt of blue poplin on the counter with both hands, steadily. "The poplin is 1 shilling and 4 pence the yard, Mrs. Stanhope. How many yards will you require?" Mrs. Stanhope bought 4 yards. She did not meet Eleanor's eyes again while her parcel was being wrapped. Eleanor wrapped it neatly and tied the string with a bow, which she cut at exactly the right length. When the bell over the door announced Mrs. Stanhope's departure, Eleanor set down the scissors and stood quietly for a moment, with both palms flat on the counter, breathing. She was good at this. She would continue to be good at it. The bell above the door rang again at 11:30, and she looked up from the accounts to find a man filling the doorway. He was tall enough that the lintel cleared his hat by less than an inch. He removed the hat when he stepped inside, and the light from the shop window caught the line of a scar through his left eyebrow, faint and old. He looked at the room with the particular quality of attention that Eleanor associated with men who were accustomed to looking at rooms and finding whatever in them was wrong. He was perhaps 34. He wore a dark coat. She recognized him. She had seen him twice at a distance. Once at a Wiltshire County Assembly in 1808, where he had arrived late and left early and been identified to her as the Earl of Ashmore, and once at a dinner in London in 1810, where he had sat 4 places down and said almost nothing, and she had sat 4 places up and said almost as little. She had a general impression of him from those occasions, contained, deliberate, and notably uninterested in performing sociability. She had not expected him to walk into a mercer's shop on Milsom Street at 11:30 on a Tuesday in October. She said, "Good morning, my lord. May I help you?" He said, "I require access to the shipping ledgers for the years 1809 to 1812. Ellsworth told me they are in the back office." He paused, and then added, with the quality of a man who has remembered that courtesy exists and is addressing the gap, "If that is possible." "The ledgers are there," she said. "Mr. Ellsworth is not available this morning, but I keep the accounts. I can assist you in locating whatever you need." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "You are Miss Cavendish," he said. "Eleanor Cavendish." "I am." He did not say anything further about that. He followed her into the back office, and she found him the relevant ledgers, and for 40 minutes he sat at the small desk with his coat on the chair beside him and read through the entries without speaking, except twice when he asked her to clarify an abbreviation. She answered both times. On the third occasion he paused at a specific page, and she saw his jaw tighten in a way that was almost nothing, and told her something had been confirmed. When he rose to leave, he said, "Keep those ledgers locked, Miss Cavendish. The pages from November of 1810 in particular. Tell Ellsworth, if you would. I will return Thursday." She said she would tell Mr. Ellsworth. He picked up his coat from the chair. Something fell from the breast pocket and landed on the desk, and he caught it before she could see it clearly, but not before she registered that it was small and oval, and that his hand closed around it with a care that was not about the object's monetary value. "Thursday," he said, and left. She stood in the back office for a moment after he was gone, with her hand resting on the locked cabinet door and a warmth in her face that she could not entirely attribute to the fire in the grate. She did not examine the warmth. She returned to the front counter and resumed the accounts. And if she was somewhat slower at the accounts that afternoon than she had been in the morning, that was entirely the product of the conversation with Mrs. Stanhope. She told herself that twice, and on the second telling, she almost believed it. 2 mornings later, she went to the apothecary's on Broad Street before the shop opened. Mr. Fry, who had mixed her father's remedies for 20 years, had died the previous spring, and his widow ran the shop now with an apprentice who was barely 18. Eleanor had found, when she went through her father's effects, a small debt of £3 and 7 shillings, accumulated across the last difficult year, which her father had been too proud to name and too ill to settle. £3.07 was not, in the context of her reduced circumstances, a trivial sum. It was approximately 2 weeks of her income. She had set it aside for 6 weeks before she went to the shop, and now she stood at the counter with the coins counted out, and Mrs. Fry looking at her over the spectacles she wore when she was computing. He owed this, Eleanor said. He would have settled it himself, if he had been able. "My dear," Mrs. Fry said, and then stopped, because there was nothing obvious to add. Eleanor placed the coins on the counter. "I hope Mrs. Fry is keeping well," she said. "Better than most," said Mrs. Fry, and covered Eleanor's hand with her own, briefly, before she withdrew it. What Eleanor did not know was that the door of the apothecary's shop had opened at the beginning of this exchange and had remained open. What she did not know was that the man in the doorway had come for a routine preparation and had stopped when he saw her at the counter and had not moved and had watched the full 3 minutes of the transaction. What she did not know was that when the door closed again, softly, behind him, he walked the length of Broad Street and stood for a full minute at the corner before continuing, which he was not in the habit of doing. She counted the coins correctly. She thanked Mrs. Fry. She left the shop. He was not on Broad Street when she emerged. She did not think to look. He returned to the mercer's shop on Thursday, as he had said he would. She had the ledgers ready. She had also spent an hour the previous evening thinking about what she had observed of the November 1810 entries and had found a second relevant page in the December records that she thought he might not know to look for. She mentioned it when he sat down. He looked at her across the desk. "How did you find that?" he said. "It is an unusual abbreviation," she said. "There are only 4 instances of it across the full 3 years. Once you see it, it is not difficult to recognize where it recurs." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Bassett is claiming the consignment was mine. His creditors have retained a solicitor." She kept her face entirely still. "I am aware," she said, "that you and Mr. Bassett were formerly in business together." "Are you aware that his claim is false?" "I did not know the specific claim," she said. "I know that Mr. Bassett has a habit of distributing his financial obligations with some creativity." The silence that followed was not the silence of a man deciding whether to be offended. It was the silence of a man recognizing something he had suspected was true. "The December entry," he said. "Show me." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to the line. His coat was on the chair again. He had set it aside when he came in, the way a man sets aside something he carries without thinking, and she registered once more the object in the breast pocket, settled at an angle that showed a curve of tortoiseshell frame, she said, before she had entirely chosen to say it. "Is that a miniature portrait?" He looked up from the ledger. He did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. "My wife," he said. "Late." "I am sorry," she said. He looked at the ledger again. 9 years, he said. He began a sentence and stopped. His hand went briefly to the coat, not to reach for the miniature, but simply to touch the place where it was, the way a man puts his hand to an old injury he has learned to carry. She was young, too young for what I permitted to be asked of her. My mother had identified her as suitable. I did not argue as strenuously as I might have. He said it to the December ledger entry. He said it in the voice of a man making a plain account of a plain fact, the way one reads a sentence off a page. Eleanor understood, from the care with which the sentence was constructed to avoid drama, precisely how much weight it carried. "I keep my mother's portrait in my sitting room," Eleanor said carefully. "She died when I was 14. Somehow it helps, having her face where I can see it, rather than stored away." He looked up then, directly at her, for the first time this session. and she felt the weight of that attention settle. "Is that the miniature on the shelf?" he said, nodding toward the small tortoise-shell frame she kept above the window. "Yes," she said. He looked at it for a moment. Then he returned to the ledger. They worked for another hour. When he rose to go, he had what he needed. The solicitor could be answered. The claim would not stand. At the door, he paused. "Miss Cavendish," he said. "The work you did on the December entry, that was not nothing. I want you to know that I know that." She said, "Good day, my lord." He left. The shop bell rang, and then was quiet. She sat in the back office for a long time with the December ledger open on the desk and her mother's portrait on the shelf, and a quality of feeling in her chest that she could not name, and that she therefore did not name, because she had learned that naming feelings was only useful if the feelings were ones you were allowed to have. George Bassett arrived in Bath on the 22nd of October with a hired post-chaise and a reduced suite of luggage, and the kind of expression that men acquire when the story they have been telling themselves has lately been revised by circumstances they did not author. Eleanor saw him through the window of the mercer's shop at 20 minutes past 9 in the morning, which gave her approximately 10 seconds to compose herself before he opened the door. He looked older than she remembered. This was not, she reflected, unreasonable. She had last seen him in the distance at a London proceeding 14 months ago, and the intervening months had done their work on his jawline and on the slightly too bright quality of his eyes. He was still dressed well, though on closer inspection the coat was last season's and the buttons had been replaced with lesser ones. She noted these things the way she noted a discrepancy in a ledger column, without judgment, but with clarity. "Eleanor," he said. He had always said her name as though it were a small privilege. "Mr. Bassett," she said. He looked at the counter, the bolts of cloth, the neat rows of accounts on the shelf behind her. "So it is true," he said, with a kind of tender regret that she recognized as the version of himself he considered most sympathetic. "You are working here." "I keep the accounts," she said. "May I assist you with something? We have an excellent selection of superfine in 3 weights. He almost smiled. "You are very composed." "I have had practice," she said. He told her then, in the manner of a man who had rehearsed the essential sentences and was now discovering that the unrehearsed ones were the ones that mattered, about Clara Vane. Clara, it turned out, had spent 18 months establishing a thorough acquaintance with his finances, and when those finances had suffered what George described as a reversal in his shipping interests, she had departed, quietly and efficiently, for the continent, taking with her a set of sapphire jewelry that George had been under the impression was merely borrowed for an evening, and a bank draft that he had been under the impression was merely a loan for living expenses. He had not, Eleanor gathered, foreseen this outcome. She listened to the full account without interrupting, because she had found, in 6 years of marriage to him, that interrupting him on the subject of himself produced a longer speech rather than a shorter one. When he had finished, she said nothing immediately, and he interpreted the silence as an opening. "I thought," he said, and then adjusted. "That is, I wondered whether you had considered." He paused. "It would not need to be formal. I am not suggesting a remarriage. Only that we are known to each other, and your situation here is surely not." He did not finish. "No," Eleanor said. He paused. "No," she said again. "Thank you for coming, George. I hope your circumstances improve. I mean that genuinely. I have built something here that is mine, and I will not dismantle it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw, somewhere behind the rehearsed regret, a flicker of something more honest, something that recognized she meant it. "You are different," he said. I have had practice, she said again. When he left, Mrs. Fry came in from the street, where she had been delivering a prescription to the house next door, and regarded the retreating figure with the expression of a woman who has been in the world long enough to have a vocabulary for what she is looking at. Was that him? Mrs. Fry said. Yes, Eleanor said. Good riddance, said Mrs. Fry, with the tone of a woman dispensing a medical opinion. Eleanor surprised herself by laughing, briefly, before she returned to the accounts. The sound of it seemed to startle her almost as much as it startled Mrs. Fry. It was the last light moment before the dark one, though she did not know that yet. The dark moment arrived on the afternoon of the 25th of October, at 20 minutes past 4, in the front room of the apothecary's shop on Broad Street. Eleanor had come to collect a preparation for her landlady, who was suffering from a persistent cough. Mrs. Fry was behind the counter, and she had the expression she wore when she had something to say that she had decided she would rather not, and had decided anyway. Sit down a moment, my dear, said Mrs. Fry. Eleanor sat down on the small chair beside the window. Mrs. Fry said she had been in the pump room this morning. You know how it is. One hears things without necessarily trying to hear them, Eleanor said. What did you hear? Lady Ashmore, said Mrs. Fry. The Dowager. She was speaking with Mrs. Prentice, the mother of the young lady that people are saying the Earl is to marry. She paused and folded her hands, and then said it plainly, because Mrs. Fry was, among her virtues, plain. She told Mrs. Prentice that he would not seriously consider a divorced woman. Those were the words she used. Eleanor looked at the window. The street was wet. It had rained through the morning, and the cobblestones held the gray light of the afternoon in small, scattered reflections. I see, she said. My dear, Mrs. Fry began. No, Eleanor said. I knew. She said this steadily, and she meant it, which was what made it hurt. I knew. I have known since the beginning of this, Mrs. Fry. I am not naive about what I am now in this city. I simply thought. She stopped herself. She had not thought anything. She had felt something, which was not the same as thought, and was considerably less reliable. She picked up the preparation for her landlady and thanked Mrs. Fry and walked home. It was the 3rd week of October, and the light in Bath at 4 in the afternoon had the particular quality of English autumn light, which is the color of an ending. The plane trees along the Avon were letting go of the last of their leaves, and the stone buildings on Sydney Place had gone gray in the damp. And Eleanor walked through it all with her coat buttoned to the throat and her hands in her pockets. And in her left pocket was her mother's miniature, and she held it as she walked, the tortoise-shell warm under her fingers. They are saying it in the pump room, Mrs. Fry had said. He would not seriously consider a divorced woman. She had not seriously thought he was considering her. She had not allowed herself to seriously think it. She had thought instead about ledger entries and December abbreviations and the quality of attention from dark eyes and the way a man puts his hand to a place where he carries grief, and she had told herself that these were observations, merely, and not things she had invested in. She sat down in her 2 rooms in Sydney Place and placed the miniature on the table before her and looked at her mother's painted face, which was small and clear and did not offer advice. I know, Eleanor said to the miniature and to herself, which was the same conversation. I know it perfectly well. She was not going to cry. She had not cried in 14 months, and she was not going to begin now. She was going to sit here until she had mastered the exact shape of this feeling, and then she was going to get up and make herself tea, and in the morning she would open the ledgers and find whatever needed to be found, and be useful to the mercer's shop and to herself. And the Earl of Ashmore would marry Miss Prentice, who was young and unencumbered, and whose name did not appear in any London gazette. And that was correct and sensible, and she had no business expecting otherwise. She sat with the miniature until the tea went cold, and then she made herself another cup, and then she went to bed. In the morning, she opened the shop. The upper rooms on the evening of the 29th of October were given over to a concert of chamber music, and Bath society had assembled for it in the kind of numbers that the season could still produce in late autumn, when the serious London families had returned to town and the rooms were left to the steady residents and the winter arrivals. Lady Dorothea Holcroft, Countess Dowager of Ashmore, had been instrumental in organizing the program. Miss Arabella Prentice sat beside the Dowager in the front row of the concert room, in a gown of pale yellow silk, with her dark hair dressed to the fashion, and her posture conveying the composed anticipation of a young woman who has been told, in careful terms, that the evening is of some significance. Charles Deverell, Earl of Ashmore, arrived at the upper rooms at 8 o'clock, and stood near the entrance hall with a glass of wine he had no particular interest in, and a quality of attention that was, to anyone looking closely, directed not at the concert room but at a question he had been settling in himself for the better part of a week. He had settled it. The question had begun to settle on the morning he stood in the doorway of Mrs. Fry's apothecary shop and watched Eleanor Cavendish place £3 and 7 shillings on a counter for a debt she had not incurred and could not easily afford, for a man who would never be in a position to thank her for it. He had come in for a routine preparation. He had stood in that doorway for 3 minutes and watched a woman perform a small act of deliberate integrity, and then leave the shop without looking back to see if anyone had noticed. He had noticed. He had been noticing, if he was honest with himself, since the first Tuesday of October, when he had watched her walk through the entrance hall of these very rooms, with a parcel under her arm and her back entirely straight, and had heard his mother's voice say what it said, and had watched Eleanor's pace not alter by a single step. He had spent 9 years learning what it cost to defer to his mother's judgment about the correct thing. He had no interest in spending the next 9 years continuing that education. The door to the east corridor opened at 8:30, and Eleanor appeared in it. She was not dressed for the concert. She wore her plain working coat and carried a parcel tied in brown paper, and she looked toward the concert room with the expression of a woman calculating the most efficient route to the room's manager's office. She had come, he understood immediately, on an errand for Ellsworth's shop. She had not come as a guest. This distinction, he recognized, was the point. She was here in a capacity that the season's hierarchy rendered invisible, which meant that she could be treated accordingly, and that anyone who wished to treat her accordingly would feel entirely justified. His mother appeared from the entrance to the concert room, before Eleanor had taken 4 steps into the corridor. Lady Dorothea moved with the particular precision of a woman who has been managing social territory for 40 years and who sees a transgression before it has fully formed. She intercepted Eleanor at the midpoint of the corridor with a smile that was warm, measured, and perfectly calibrated to convey that what came next was not cruelty, but merely management. "Miss Cavendish," Lady Dorothea said. "How unexpectedly convenient. Tradespeople with deliveries for the rooms generally find that the service entrance is more comfortable for everyone. On the left, as you go back toward the street," she gestured courteously. She was not raising her voice. She was not, by the norms of the world she inhabited, doing anything wrong. She was redirecting a divorced woman in a working coat from the corridor of a concert, attended by people of quality. And she was doing it with the tone of a woman offering a helpful suggestion. And there was not a witness in that corridor who would have found her at fault. Eleanor looked at her. Her face was very still. "Thank you, Lady Ashmore," she said quietly. She turned. Charles set down his wineglass. He crossed the corridor in 8 strides. Eleanor had not yet reached the door when he was beside her, and he was aware, at the edge of his attention, of the small group of guests who had come out of the concert room between sets and who were now watching, and of his mother's fan, which had stilled in her hand. "Miss Cavendish," he said. Eleanor turned. She looked at him, and he saw in her face the specific quality of a person who has been surprised by something they had decided not to hope for. He said, in the level voice he used when he had decided something and was prepared to be accountable for it, "Miss Cavendish is my intended. I have no other." He said it at a pitch that carried. He said it once. The corridor was very quiet. Lady Dorothea looked at her son. Her fan did not move. Her expression for a moment was not the expression of a woman who has been publicly overruled. It was the expression of a woman who has recognized, slowly and precisely, that the script she has been performing has been written for the wrong play, and that she has only now, at this moment, understood it. She was not, in this instant, calculating a response. She was reckoning with something. Miss Prentice, who had followed Lady Dorothea out of the concert room and who was standing 3 steps behind her, took 1 step backward, quietly, and looked at the floor. She was not humiliated. She was too composed and too young and too recently arrived in these arrangements to be humiliated. She was simply stepping back from a claim that had, it now emerged, never quite been hers to make. One of the guests near the concert room door said something low to his companion. His companion said, "Did he just?" A pause. "Yes," said the first man. Eleanor was looking at Charles. She was not looking at anyone else. Her expression, which he had spent 6 weeks observing in the careful and deniable way that men observe things they are not yet ready to name, had for the first time since he had known her gone entirely unguarded, and what was in it was not triumph, and not relief. Precisely. And not joy. Precisely. It was the expression of a woman who has spent 14 months reconstructing the version of herself that requires nothing from anyone, and who has just been asked, quietly and publicly, to let that version go. He held out his hand, palm up. She looked at it for a full second. He counted. She placed her hand in his. He said quietly, so that only she could hear, "I have been watching you since October. It has not been sufficient." "You might have said something earlier," she said, equally quietly. "I was arriving at a conclusion," he said. 3 weeks, she said. "I wanted to be certain I was right," he said. She looked at him, and something in her face did something he had not quite seen before, which was that the composure she habitually wore the way she wore her coat, buttoned to the throat against the cold, shifted very slightly, and what was underneath it was not performance at all. "Were you?" she said. "Yes," he said. The concert resumed in the room behind them, the strings finding their pitch and then settling into it, and Lady Dorothea turned and went back into the concert room without speaking, and the guests near the door followed her, and the corridor was empty. And Eleanor stood with her hand in Charles Deverell's and the parcel for the room's manager still tucked under her other arm, and neither of them said anything further for a moment, because nothing further needed to be said. The parcel was delivered. The room's manager received it without incident. Charles walked her home to Sydney Place through the October night, and the plane trees were nearly bare, and the gas lamps on the pavement cast long shadows, and they walked at the proper distance from each other, which was to say not quite far enough, and when he said good night at the door of her lodging-house, he held her hand again. Briefly, and the brevity of it was the kind of brevity that contains an entire paragraph. She went inside. She stood in her 2 rooms with her coat still buttoned and felt, for the first time in 14 months, the specific sensation of a person standing at the beginning of something rather than the end. It was an unfamiliar sensation. She was very careful with it. She placed her mother's miniature on the table and looked at it for a long time, and her mother's painted face looked back with the same expression it always had, which was not advice, precisely, but which meant something. Today, that it had not meant yesterday. The engagement was made formal on the morning of the 4th of November. Mr. Fielding, the solicitor, was present, not because the situation required managing, but because Charles had decided that anything he undertook to do with his life from this point forward should be done with full procedural clarity, and that what he was undertaking now was the most serious undertaking of his life, and it deserved to be treated accordingly. The settlement was generous. It was not the generosity of a man compensating for something he had taken. It was the generosity of a man who had decided to give, which is different. And Eleanor recognized the difference, which was why she did not object to the sum. Lady Dorothea sent a note that was brief and correct, which was the note of a woman who is not going to fight a battle she has recognized she lost before it began. She did not attend the signing. She retreated to the dower house at the Ashmore estate, which had been prepared for her the previous spring in anticipation of an eventual transition that she had been resisting, and she did not resist it now. Bassett left Bath the same week. He went to Bristol, where he had a cousin who was better off than he was. And he went with the expressions of a man who has been administered a lesson by circumstance and is in the process of absorbing it. He did not trouble Eleanor again. Miss Prentice received, by the end of November, an offer from a baronet's son from Oxfordshire who had met her at the October concert and found her, on closer acquaintance, the most agreeable young woman he had ever encountered. She accepted him in December, with a private relief that she could not quite name and did not try to. Winter came to Bath in the particular way winter comes to that city, which is with fog off the Avon and a premature darkness and a quality of closeness in the stone streets that can feel, to the right person, like shelter rather than enclosure. Eleanor found it felt like shelter. She moved into Ashmore House in Laura Place on the 1st of December, before the wedding, because Charles had pointed out that her lodgings were inadequate to the temperature, and that there was a perfectly good set of rooms on the 2nd floor that were not being used, and because his housekeeper, Mrs. Anstey, who was 67 and had opinions about most things, had taken a view of Eleanor on their second meeting that was approximately the view Mrs. Fry had taken, which was the view of women of a certain experience who recognize quality when they encounter it, and do not see the point in being coy about the recognition. Mrs. Fry called on Eleanor at Ashmore House on the 3rd of December and stayed for tea, and was thoroughly approving of the drawing room. The wedding was quiet. It was a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of December, with 6 inches of new snow on the ground and a sky the color of pewter, and the ceremony was performed by the vicar of the parish church on the road to Bathampton, in the presence of Mr. Fielding, Mrs. Anstey, Mrs. Fry, and 3 other guests who were all that Charles had in the way of friends he felt were entitled to witness something that mattered. They walked back to Laura Place through the snow, which fell steadily and without apology, and covered the roads and the plane trees and the stone walls of the city equally, as if it were starting everything from the same clean surface. That evening, in the study at Ashmore House, Eleanor placed her mother's miniature on the mantelpiece. She set it so that her mother's painted face looked out at the room, which is how she had always kept it, and it looked out at the room now with the same expression it had always had. and Eleanor thought that this was the right place for it. Here where the fire burned and the window gave onto the snow-covered garden. And the room was a room that was hers now, properly and finally, and not borrowed and not provisional. She noticed, when she turned from the mantelpiece, that the oval portrait Charles had carried in his breast pocket for 9 years was not on the desk where he sometimes placed it in the evenings. She did not say anything. She did not look for it. He came in from the hall and stood in the doorway and looked at her mother's portrait on the mantelpiece, and then at Eleanor. And she saw in his face something she had seen there before only in fragments, the thing under the composure, which was not severity, but was care. Deliberate and specific. The kind of care a man applies only when he is no longer willing to distribute it indiscriminately. "Your mother?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. He crossed the room. He did not cross it in 8 strides this time. He crossed it in 2, because the room was smaller, and because the distance between them now required less covering. The fire burned. The snow came down outside the window, steady and unhurried, adding itself to everything that had already fallen. In the portrait gallery on the 2nd floor, in a frame of dark wood that suited it, a small oval painting of a young woman with fair hair and a serious expression had been hung between 2 larger works, where she looked out at the corridor with the composure of a person who has been given a permanent address. She was not in a coat pocket. She was not being carried any longer as a weight. She was in her proper place. That was enough. That, in the end, was all that anything required. To be in its proper place, at last, and to have been placed there by someone who knew the difference between carrying and holding. If Eleanor's story has found you in a quiet moment of your own, leave a word in the comments. This channel is kept alive by the people who stay until the end. The snow fell. The fire held. Somewhere upstairs, in the portrait gallery, the world had been arranged correctly at last, and no one needed to explain to anyone how it had been done. It simply had been.